Welcome to pre-conference lectures of 11th Indian Social Work Congress 2023. For the second pre-conference lecture, it is honor for us to have Dr. P.M. Garrett from University of Galway, Republic of Ireland. Dr. Garrett, on behalf of our association, National Association of Professional Social Workers in India, and my university, which is the host university for 11th Indian Social Work Congress, on behalf of my university, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Hyderabad, India, I welcome you. You also accept greetings on behalf of my colleagues because they are all fascinated with your writings and they have personally asked me to convey their specific greetings to you. It is a great privilege that Dr. Garrett, who is probably, and I must say, who is really one of the few finest scholars of social work in the contemporary world. And my words may be taken lightly, then I must quote and support and substantiate that the prestigious International Journal of Social Welfare has recognized and reported and considered Professor Garrett as one of the most prominent critical social work theorists in the English-speaking world. Dr. Garrett has written enormously, but some of the books I would like through this platform that young readers in India and abroad must read. And one of those is Dissenting Social Work, and the forthcoming book, The Social Work and Common Sense. Dr. Garrett tells us very finely how to approach critical social realities, how to make use of social theories for understanding social realities. That is in this context that his writings that appeared in journals like British Journal of Social Work, International Social Work, European Journal of Social Work, where he tells us how critical social theorists, whether it is Gramsci or Bourdieu or other critical thinkers, how to approach them and how to make use of them for understanding what we call as normative social realities, which are full of dominant hegemonies. Garrett has helped us a lot, and personally, I benefit a lot by reading his writings in understanding Gramscian lens and making sense of hegemonic realities in the country context. His recent experiment with common sense is also important, and as social workers, we must understand how popular common sense makes a hegemonic reality as normal and natural. And that is where common sense becomes important. So, Dr. Garrett, welcome to this pre-conference lecture. I again thank you for this lecture, for accepting our invitation. Dr. Garrett has kindly accepted that he will speak on dissenting social work and destabilizing common sense. I'm sure his lecture is going to help us to deliberate a lot in the actual conference on the theme of revisiting pedagogy and practice of social work in India. So once again, thank you, sir, and I request you to please start your lecture.
Okay, thank you, Professor Shahid. It's a tremendous honor and privilege to be invited to speak at the conference. So thank you. Thank you also for your tremendously kind and generous remarks, which leaves me feeling a little embarrassed. But thank you for the remarks. Now, just to say to colleagues, I would not be entirely comfortable with the form in terms of presenting online. So I'd ask that you perhaps be a little patient with me. I prepared a number of slides which I hope are of use to the conference and link with some of the themes. Unfortunately, I'm not there to have discussion with you on some of the issues raised, but should anyone want to contact me, then of course my email address is there. So please feel free to contact me. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to make connections with the theme of the conference as touched on by Professor Shahid. So as we see from the brochure, from the literature, one of the core aims of the conference is to discuss and to deliberate some of the important issues and challenges for professional social work today. And we're also told in the literature that social work is committed to transforming our world. The global commitment is to leave no one behind in turbulent times also finds its way into the conference as one of the themes and preoccupations. And I guess one of the phrases that stood out for me as I read the brochure was this notion of adhering to the pedagogy of the question rather than the answer. And for me, that conveyed in itself, it kind of captured, I guess, the critical vibe of the conference, which you're hoping to establish. And as we see, one of the conference sub-themes is the social work curriculum, pedagogy and pedagogical challenges. So in these slides, which I've put together, essentially a few notes, what I'm endeavoring to do is to try to get into kind of conversation with some of these themes. And clearly, much of what I say will be very much related to my location within social work academic setting in Ireland. I've not been to India. My knowledge of India is limited. So please bear that in mind in terms of I'm looking at these issues through a particular window. So this is the direction I would like to briefly take us in. I want to touch on the end of social work debate. Again, I don't know how significant this debate is within India, but it's certainly featuring elsewhere in Europe, in the States, in academic debates around social work. Something about Gramsci and thinking about the conjuncture. As Professor Shahid said, I'm constantly kind of captivated by Gramsci's work. Something on social work praxis and education at the conjuncture, a little on dissenting social work, and then finally just shifting towards, as Professor Shahid signaled, what's going on with my next book in relation to social work and common sense. So I'm hoping I'm not overly packing this. We'll see how we get along. So I suppose one of the as I say, one of the key issues that's been around in the literature in a number of parts of the world recently has been this notion that social work should end. And I suppose a prominent representative of this line of reasoning was the Australian social work academic Chris Melia, who wrote a very accessible and provocative article in the British Journal of Social Work, which I guess people attending the conference may have seen. It's worth looking at. I guess there's a need to make the connections between whether the article relates to the realities of India or not. Is it too kind of Anglo-American world-centric? I guess that's one of the questions that needs to be posed in that regard. But essentially, the article makes the claim that the social work has actually betrayed its mission, that social work no longer adheres to, in reality, to commitments to social justice, liberation, human rights, as featured in the International Federation of Social Work definition of the profession. Social workers are perceived as child stealers. Social workers cooperated with a number of oppressive regimes and oppressive practices, both in the contemporary world and in the past. And here Melia refers to social work under the apartheid regime. He refers to social work during the period of Nazism. And the argument he makes is that essentially social workers, and perhaps particularly social work educators, kind of con students with a rhetoric around social justice and human rights, whereas once they get into practice, the situation is entirely different. And even worse, perhaps, social work as a field of activity and as a discipline actually serves to distract idealistic young people from campaigns and social movements to better promote real social change. Now, I responded to this article in the British Journal of Social Work, and essentially my position was the article should be welcomed. There's much in it that is worthwhile. However, I tried to argue that there are a number of failings with the article. The notion that social workers are child stealers. If one looks at some of the literature emerging from the UK, from Australia, and so on, public perceptions are much more complicated. The public, by and large, view social workers in a good light. Although fascinatingly, the notion of social workers as child stealers is more reflective of social workers' own attitudes as to how they think, misguidedly think the public are tending to view them. And I also thought that Melia gave a very vague notion as to where these spaces were that people could truly commit to kind of meaningful social justice activity and so on. I thought this was a rather idealistic take, almost suggesting that there's a realm beyond social work that wasn't saturated with neoliberal imperatives, and I found that kind of unconvincing. However, I'm apt to share this article with students, encourage them to read it, because, as I say, he does pose a number of important questions. And the argument, an adjacent argument, is around in the United States around kind of abolitionist social work and so on and so on. And I guess my position has tended to be that the notion that social work is going to end is somewhat ridiculous. Social work is going to continue because it fulfills, if nothing else, an important function for the state. So the key thing then becomes, what is to be done? How can social work potentially be transformed and orientated into a more progressive direction, if you will? And as I note on the foot of the slide, the answers will be different in different places, because social work has different historical trajectories and so on, different cultures and so on and so on. And just to say the book that I'm highlighting on the slide, there is an American academic called Burgatz, who again is a person who argues against the notion that social work should end. However, I would argue his position is perhaps overly US-centric. So in terms of thinking about what's to be done, again, I turn to Gramsci again, and I'm aware of the fact there is a rich tradition of scholarship in India. I'm particularly fascinated, again, the reference in the brochure for the conference, some of the work being done at MANUU University, if I can refer to it as such, where we're told that the social work department has initiated a skill lab for facilitating students to make sense of hegemonic common sense. That in itself just seems a tremendously progressive initiative. And I wish at the university that I worked here in Ireland, there were such progressive initiatives as this. So I guess, again, that reflects highly upon Professor Shahid and the number of colleagues and students who are working with him around this perspective, the Gramscian perspective. Now it sheds light on particular factors to do with India and Indian social work in India. So Gramsci, I guess, he encourages to think about the conjuncture, about thinking about the time and space in which we find ourselves. And I guess this explicitly or implicitly will be one of the factors underpinning your conference. What are the obstacles and opportunities to generate meaningful and progressive social social change. And in my teaching with students here in Galway, I try to encourage them to think about the conjuncture, to think about the wider world, to think about the big picture, but also not to neglect, the local, the specific, what's going on within their particular field, with the clients they're engaging with, what's going on in the office. How is there a dialectical interplay between the conjuncture at the level of the macro and the micro? And as we see here, I've just listed a number of factors which seem significant at the conjuncture. And again, my perspective is in part, it reflects my positionality, my place in the world, my age, my gender, and race, ethnicity, and so on. But I guess the key thing for me is still neoliberalism. We live in a world ordered, structured, and driven by the imperatives of the global ruling class. And I think the global ruling class is perhaps even more identifiable now than it was in Marx's day. There is such a tremendous concentration of wealth amongst a relatively small number of individuals and corporations. Neoliberalism can't be separated from issues to do with migration and the toxic politics of migration, global warming, which those of you in the global south are clearly more vulnerable to in terms of what's going on, the threat of neo-fascism, more recently wars in Ukraine, Palestine, Israel. We seem to have a series of intermeshed crises. And I think, again, drawing on Gramsci, the notion of the interregnum, we seem again to be at a place where the old is dying and the new cannot be born. That's the big picture. I just want to turn to social work at the conjuncture now, and I don't want to be perceived as like arrogantly laying out this is how it is. These are just a few notes. Now, one of the things that's clear is that social work globally, in terms of numbers, seems to be in spectacularly healthy shape. In China, for example, there's reference to a new spring of social work after its abolition during the period of Mao. It was expected to be 1.5 million social workers by 2020. We're told in 2021 in the US, the field was due to grow by 16% over the coming decades, with some of the best job growth in the nation. So if one has regard simply to the numerical inflation in numbers, everything would seem to be going quite well in terms of the growth of the profession. Yet at the same time, and this is the direction I'd like to just take us in now, there's also a sense maybe that despite the growth in numbers, something is going wrong. And one of the things that's taking place, I would suggest, and again, I wouldn't be familiar with how this may be playing out in India. I guess that's a question for conference participants to probably consider. But there's certainly moves to reorientate social work and to remake it from above. As we see, the International Federation of Social Work definition foregrounds the safeguarding and promotion of human rights as a core value for social work. So briefly, I want to turn to what's gone on in Ireland of late, and I refer to this in the book, Dissenting Social Work. In fact, the book begins with this very issue. As we see, in Ireland, there are 5,000 social workers. CORU is the regulatory body which accredits social work courses and maintains a register of accredited social workers. And as we see in 2019, I think something extraordinary happened. It simply decided to delete the phrase human rights from the code. I and a number of others have perceived this as a deeply kind of retrograde step. And it could be interpreted as seeking to, maybe as part of a range of other measures, seeking to kind of shape social workers in a way that they have appropriate ideological opinions and perceptions. So, for example, if they maintain a continuing commitment to human rights and defend service provision for clients, subject to budgetary constraints and cuts, then they may become regarded as unfit for purpose, unfit for the task of social work. And in this sense, is the notion of human rights, a commitment to the furtherance of human rights, becoming too political, given the social misery faced by many users of services? And as we see from the slide, I'm suggesting this is it's all clearly from one corner of the world, from Ireland, but it may be of interest to participants at the conference. This is a blatant attempt to prevent social workers relying on a human rights defence if they choose to act in defiance of governments and employers' demands that run counter to such rights. And I guess this prompts the question, is social work being drained? Is it being bled of its more progressive ethical impulses? Is this an example of a transformation which is occurring? Professor Shahid, am I doing okay for time?
It's fine, sir. Please
Okay,
carry on.
thank you.
Yeah.
Now, again, just touching on this theme without interrogating it in too much detail, I would kind of accept the notion after Althusser that social work might be perceived as part of a state's ideological state apparatuses, helping to regulate social production within regimes of capital accumulation and indeed institutionalized, racialized, and gendered social orders. Yet at the same time, I think we can perhaps argue that there has always been some locations, some spaces for progressive social work. And I wonder if we're at a moment where these progressive spaces are at risk of being eroded or even closed down. Again, I don't know how meaningful that question will be if posed in an Indian context, but it's clearly something that in parts of Europe, in the United States, this question is perhaps worth considering. Are we moving to a period where compliance is viewed as an indicator of professionalism? More emphatically, is compliance professionalism? Is criticality being potentially squeezed out of social work and social work education? And I suppose if I may just join on Marx, I mean, struck by the phrase, clearly Marx didn't write on social work, but he wrote of kind of, I guess in a kind of ethical sense, capitalism tended to move in a way that kind of hollowed out people. People became completely emptied out. And I suppose I'm thinking, is social work at risk of being hollowed out, completely emptied out of its progressive dimensions? Yeah. And in this sense, are the projects to install a new professional common sense? And I'll touch on this theme toward the end of this presentation. And again, just to indicate, I think Professor Shahid and colleagues have been doing some really fascinating work in relation to common sense in India around issues of disability, of caste, and so on and so on. Not using a Gramscian lens, I've also been impressed by some of the work that a younger scholar, Urbajit Mishka, forgive me if I pronounced his name wrong, looking through a Foucauldian lens at the history of social work in India. Tremendously interesting material that he's been presenting in a number of journals. So going back to the main preoccupation, I suppose the question is, are there sustained attempts or efforts to render educators and practitioners ideologically safe and cleansed of any dissenting or politically disruptive tendencies? And, you know, is there, and I here just very briefly drawing on Bridger and Wakwan, they identify, you know, this notion, as we may be familiar with, of a field. A field is a discipline or area of social space that is relatively autonomous. And their concern is that, subject to neoliberal imperatives, fields previously retaining a degree of autonomy can become pathologized, can become apparatuses, used in a different sense than Althusser. And I think this notion is arguably fruitful in terms of thinking about some of maybe the transformations taking place in social work. Is there a movement taking place in some countries from the field to the apparatus, where social work is becoming more orientated from the top? And the instance I referred to in relation to the disappearance, the abduction of human rights from the social work code of ethics in Ireland seems to suggest that danger may be around. In this context, as we see, Wakwan reminds us that agents of the state must defend the dignity and integrity of their occupations and refuse to let themselves be roped into assuming degraded versions of social and health functions that do not properly fall to them. In this context, the revised Irish Code of Ethics for Social Work that I referred to is a degraded version. It presents a degraded version of the social work role. And just very briefly, I'm here referring to changes taking place in other countries, which are equally kind of troubling. In England, attempts to set up successful attempts to set up an organisation called Frontline, which provided a fast-track route into social work for a potential officer class. People coming from backgrounds in banking, consultancy, and so on, who it was said would present more aspirational figures for example, children in contact with child and family social work services. In Scandinavia, we're told, in Sweden, social workers who adjust themselves to neoliberal routines are rewarded, and those protesting are punished and denied promotion. In Scotland, some work done by Jane Fenton that argues that social work, some younger students undertaking social work training struggle to think critically and lack interest in unpacking neoliberal assumptions. I don't want, however, to be seen as entirely endorsing this perspective, because I think some younger students have been at the heart of lots of political activism of late, around climate emergency, around Black Lives Matter, and so on and so on. As I try to indicate at the foot of the slide, I often think that certainly the students who I have contact with on an MA in social work course are actually, if I can use the phrase, more in tune with, clued up about the world, oftentimes than maybe social work educators are, which may seem something of a provocative comment. But I think students, and again, I wouldn't know whether this reflects the picture in India, but students are often having to deal with private social care agencies that have exploitative practices that pay an extortionate amounts of money for rent. And some of the students are also have been at the center of kind of immigration policing as well. So, their habitus is actually more conducive to understanding the world than again, perhaps somewhat provocatively, than social work educators are occasionally. Moving on to what I'm calling dissenting social work, and perhaps just a few minutes on this. In my thinking about dissenting social work, I was partly influenced by some of Anna Arendt's concerns about thoughtlessness. I mean, as colleagues may know, in her famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, she spoke about Eichmann's kind of thoughtlessness in terms of his role in meticulously plotting the timetabling of trains and so on that took people to gas chambers. But his vision was so focal, the end point, the outcome of his meticulous planning didn't occur to him. He was a thoughtless character. Similarly, Frantz Fanon talks about, and Fanon, of course, was not only someone who struggled for liberation, he was in a profession which is kindred to social work. He's a practicing psychiatrist. He talked about the dangers of becoming stuck in habits and gestures that follow other gestures without novelty. That not only the colonized, but certain professionals risked becoming decelebrized. Again, similar to Arendt, the concern is about a lack of criticality. And here again, I'd just like to mention some of the work that Professor Shahid has done in relation to questioning dominant perceptions and vocabulary around disability in India. I think that's an example of efforts to kind of counter kind of thoughtlessness, maybe within particular spheres. So briefly on dissenting social work. Dissenting social work, as I view it, is a form of social work which contests the idea that social work educators and practitioners should simply serve as the unquestioning, functioning auxiliaries of capitalism and the institutional orders that it requires. Now, in sketching out some of the potential coordinates around dissenting social work, I'm not so naive as to suggest that dissenting social work will ever become a majority preoccupation within the field of social work. But I am suggesting that if ideas connected to dissenting social work attract a sizable kind of fraction within the profession in places like Ireland, who then link up and form coalitions with other social movements and progressive professionals in other spheres, then dissent can become more meaningful. So the argument is that expansive and dissenting forms of thinking in the times at which we live at the conjuncture are vital. And I think if people like me, and I suppose what's going on here, much of this is kind of an act of self-criticism. If people like me don't begin to engage with core issues within the profession in a more critical way, then the alternative is a kind of dystopian form of social work may evolve, where practitioners simply become functionaries steered by algorithms, machine learning, and so on. I'm suggesting also, of course, that dissent has very different meanings and consequences in different places. So in terms of how some of the ideas I'm going to refer to may have meaning in India, they may not. I guess it's just for colleagues to kind of maybe consider. Also suggesting, and I've written on this theme, that maybe dissent, as a number of Black feminist writers have suggested, that if one's attentive to dissent, one may need to revisit the old notion of anger, because and I've discussed this a number of times with student social workers, I think within our profession, there may be an undue focus on the management and the containment and the elimination of anger. Now, anger can clearly be kind of toxic, but anger can also provide the fuel, if you will, which can provide, the motor for more progressive changes and forms of resistance. And I think in many parts of the world, we did see that with, for example, the Black Lives Matters movement. So I'm not the first to refer to social work in the context of dissent. So here, as we see, I refer to 1977, when neoliberalism, certainly in the US, was first, becoming gradually embedded. Cooper refers to social work as a dissenting profession. More recently, Fronek and Chester in Australasia argue that social work is a dissenting profession because in order to uphold its mission, social workers are agents of change obligated to address social injustice and breaches of human rights where they occur. And again, this statement may very well be attached to some of the core themes of your conference as laid out in the conference brochure. So Fronek and Chester go on, the challenge is how to transcend from personal outrage to social influence and the rejection of the unacceptable through moral and ethical actions. And I guess that is the core challenge. And what I've tried to do in my book, Dissenting Social Work, is to focus on maybe 12 themes or commitments. And to be very clear, in focusing on 12 themes or commitments, I'm not trying to provide a blueprint or an action plan. I'm trying to provide something of a kind of different thinking space. And the points I articulate, the 12 points I'm suggesting, can be, just changed. They can be supplanted, and there may be other more meaningful points that I've left out. And I suppose I'm here also conscious of the fact that I suppose within kind of Marxism, there's a skepticism about maybe even the role of progressive ideas, because the materiality of change is kind of vital. But at the same time, I think Marx also emphasized the importance of changing mental conceptions, that mental conceptions can help to provide something of the driver for kind of meaningful material ideological change. So again, just for debate, I sketched out a number of coordinates, and here they are. The font sizes are kind of small. I'm not going to go through them now because I'm probably detaining you too long anyhow with this presentation. I include them in the book Dissenting Social Work. I include these 12 points also in my response to Chris Medlia in the article in the British Journal of Social Work called The World to Win. And it'd be lovely to hear from colleagues in India as to, how meaningful some of these points are. What's omitted? Where's my reasoning, my thinking flawed? As I say, the aim is to kind of generate discussion and to try and bring about a new kind of vibrancy, a critical vibrancy within the field of social work. But that said, it's still quite a kind of modest endeavor, I think. Again, I'm drawing to a close. I'm suggesting that we must try to kind of make progressive gains and not simply virtue signal. And the key question becomes, what are the opportunities for dissent? What are the obstacles? How can obstacles be challenged by the creation of dissenting alliances? Again, very much influenced by Gramsci and the point about creating, nurturing, sustaining forms of counter-hegemony. Collective action is essential, and those motivated by some of the imperatives I've sketched out might begin to think about creating oppositional structures within structures, dissenting structures inside of official social work and educational organizations. And I guess in saying that, I'm conscious of the fact that in England and certain parts of Europe for a number of years, there's been an organization called the Social Work Action Network, SWAN. It was active in Ireland for a number of years, but has kind of fizzled out, if you will, now. But I think SWAN provide an example of, this notion of creating oppositional structures within structures. And then here I simply refer to, and this is my penultimate slide, some of the ambiguities of dissent. I'm not seeking to fetishize dissent. Clearly, the purpose of dissent and its desired outcome is of the utmost significance. So, for example, one can have fascists who dissent in relation to issues to do with migration and so on, which is to be challenged. I'm thinking of here in Ireland, where we have a number of groups coming together to oppose the presence of asylum seekers in their community. They can clearly be perceived as dissenters, but they're not progressive dissenters. I acknowledge that kind of the mute compulsion of capitalist relations also fosters compliance. It's very difficult to be dissenting in neoliberal organizations. What might be dissent could paradoxically be an expression of fidelity to other more progressive professional norms and values. So, for example, if one condemns the revised code of ethics for social work in Ireland, it may be because of fidelity to the International Federation Code of Ethics, which is much more progressive. I suggest it's easy to incorporate dissent into the mainstream. Vitally, the positionality and location of the dissenter is crucial. So, for example, here it's easier for me, a white middle-aged man, to be dissenting than it would be for a young black female student newly qualified to embark on kind of forms of dissent in her first job. There's cultural variability in terms of dissent. There's different kind of vocabularies expressing dissent. But importantly, perhaps most importantly, at the end of the slide, I refer to how important it is for dissent to become collectivized as opposed to a singular endeavor, because singular dissenters are apt to get marginalized, maybe in some settings even kind of bullied, and so on. Just referred to, I guess, some of my more recent work, although this primarily is by a Zimbabwean scholar and myself, Washington Marabat Sanga, looking at how we destabilize colonial common sense. And this is my penultimate slide. Just Professor Shaid referred to a book that I'm presently working on social work and common sense. And on this slide, I simply refer to some of the themes that I'm trying to address in the book. I would hope I'm not going to go through the slide bullet point by bullet point, because I think I've taken enough time, but I will, with the permission of Professor Shaid, share the slides with the conference. And then finally, clearly I'm not at the conference in person. As I said at the outset, I'm very grateful. It was lovely just to get the email out of the blue, invite me to come along, if only online, to say a few words. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to participate, albeit in this form. And I hope you have a great conference. And if anyone wants to, contact me via email, just fire away the email. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. It's really an enlightening lecture, and I think you have provided much food for thought to the prospective participants of 11th Indian Social Work Congress. I think you have rightly pointed out, and I can take a lesson for a country like India with enormous diversity and acute disparities. I think social work can't remain in the comforts of apolitical social work. It has to become dissenting social work. And rather, to use Gramsci, I must say social work has to become anti hegemonic in nature. So, thanks a lot. Hope we will be connecting again soon. Thank you very much. Thank you for your wishes. I'm sure your words are going to make much contribution to our conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.